Welcome, everybody, to Crystal, Kyle, and Friends. Today, we're going to be talking to Jonah Furman of Labor Notes, and we're going to be talking about probably the biggest story of the week, which is, of course, the rail deal.
Yeah, Biden's betrayal of workers.
Yeah, it's okay. So just to give everybody the backstory, and obviously we'll talk about all the specifics with Noah. What went down is, what was it, a month ago or a few weeks ago, there was the threat of a rail strike. And Biden intervened, and they negotiated like a temporary deal to avert the strike, or at least push a potential strike date back. Now, as part of that deal, they did get pay raises, but the sticking point where there was massive disagreement was over paid sick leave. And there was either no paid sick leave in the deal or 1 day paid sick leave, and they were asking for like a week or 2 weeks or something like that. Yeah, understandably so.
Yes.
And so the unions voted on it. Most of them actually voted in favor of the deal, but there were 4 unions out of, I believe, 12 that voted against the deal.
Right, and including the largest union, because, you know, it's wildly different how many workers these different unions represent. A number of the ones that did vote in favor of the deal, it was very narrow, so there was clearly a lot of unhappiness with this deal that was negotiated by the union leadership and the rail bosses.
So then the one way to stop the strike would be if Congress intervenes and basically votes in favor of forcing them to take the deal.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the most Weasley part of this, though, is Pelosi gets on the floor of Congress and starts virtue signaling about how, this corporate greed is out of control and we got to look out for the workers and all this stuff. And so what she does is she puts 2 bills on the floor. One of them to force the unpopular deal, which wasn't approved by the workers, through, and then another one to grant 7 days paid sick leave. Now, for those of you who don't understand the ins and outs of politics, there's only one reason why Pelosi would split those bills. Knowing, hey, this first one, the one that forces the workers to take the deal, that's going to pass the House, that's going to pass the Senate, that's going to become law, and we're going to destroy the strike. The paid sick leave bill, I didn't see the results. It may have passed the House. Okay. But it's going to probably die in the Senate. So you separate those things out to virtue signal, like, I'm fighting for these working people, but ultimately, you know the paid sick leave is going to die. If you really wanted to fight for it, you had to put it in the original bill.
Even worse than that, it also gave progressives who were upset about having the original deal crammed down the throat of the workers, it gave them an out to still vote for breaking the strike, but then also vote for the paid sick leave and be like, see, we're standing up for workers.
And tell me if you agree with this, I think they know they're full of shit. They know why the 2 bills were separated out.
Of course.
Yeah, so they're lying and they're bullshitting as if they're fighting for these workers and they're stabbing them in the back.
Well, and what's really humiliating is, I mean, first of all, let's be clear. In the House, the paid sick leave portion passes. Every Democrat votes for it and only 3 Republicans. So let's be clear about where all of their like pro-working class rhetoric on the right actually is. But it's also humiliating because in the Senate, Marco Rubio, after Biden announces like, we're going to break this strike and we're going to cram this deal down, Marco Rubio gets to his left and is like, no, this is wrong. I'm not voting for it. And him, Josh Hawley, and Ted Cruz.
And Newt Gingrich, too, was on Twitter saying the same thing. But I will say this, because I think this is important. If it actually came down to their vote, they would have forced the deal on the workers, too. This is all posturing, is my point.
I don't know about that because I think they would enjoy, if the economy suffers under Biden, that's fine for them. They don't care. So I actually think they would stick with what they've said publicly and not vote for the
I don't agree
the deal.
At all. Yeah, I don't agree at all.
But they ultimately don't need their vote because all the Democrats and most of the Republicans will vote for it anyway.
Correct. Yeah. So, but that's why I think they're doing it. They can posture.
Yeah, they can posture and it's costless.
Correct.
It's costless.
Yeah.
It puts them in the right place from a partisan perspective. They get to pretend like they're pro-worker. I mean, I'm not saying any of this is anything but cynical calculation, but it's still humiliating for Democrats.
It's massively humiliating for Democrats. And Biden, with this one instance, destroys all of his credibility with unions and Mr. I'm the pro-labor president. No, you're fucking not. Fuck out of here. This is, okay, I'm gonna go insane, but let me just... So I covered a story the other day, 4-day work week story.
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah.
New trial in the UK, thousands of workers in it, 100 companies in it. Everybody's already happy as long as they've been doing it. So I went back and checked out an article that was similar to that from 2013 in Alternate. Did you know Republican President William Howard Taft said that every worker in America should get 3 months paid vacation? There was a time we were this close to getting a 30-hour work week during the New Deal era The bill actually passed the Senate. And then at the last minute, actually, this is one where FDR fucked up. At the last minute, FDR dropped support for it, and instead they went with some other New Deal program as opposed to the 30-hour work week.
Yeah.
So look at what's going on here. There was a time when a conservative Republican president was saying every man, woman, every worker in America should get 3 months paid vacation time. Now you have a Democratic president who postures like, I'm the most pro-union, president there's ever been, and you can't even get a week of paid time off for these workers?
Right.
You cuck yourself that much?
And has just completely adopted the language and the framing of the corporate executives who have taken stock buybacks, record profits.
Absolutely.
I mean, this would do nothing to their bottom line would
3% of their profits.
Perfectly good shape if they just gave these workers a few days off. And that's what this is ultimately all over, is the willingness of these corporate bosses to tank the entire economy to make sure they don't lose a penny off of their profit margins. And it's grotesque. And Biden has adopted their framing, talking all about, the economic impact of a strike. We can't possibly have that. I just saw actually polling today from More Perfect Union saying, you know what, the American people, even when you tell them that a strike will have negative economic impacts, they still support the workers and say it's worthwhile to have the strike. And if you look at the income data, it's not surprising. The higher you are up on that income ladder, the more likely you are to say, we can't have the economic impact. The working class people are overwhelmingly in support of the workers here. And yeah, Biden postures like he's pro-working class, pro-labor. I have been very complimentary of the personnel he's put on the National Labor Relations Board, which has been extraordinarily important for this grassroots labor movement. But then you look at some of the other details, you say, how come you didn't do what you promised on the campaign trail and withhold federal government contracts from union busters like you said you would? How come instead you just invited Christian Smalls and other workers to the Oval Office in some virtue signal play and didn't actually use the power of your office? What happened to your push to pass the PRO Act? Where did that go?
Which would have been transformative, by the way.
Which would have been transformative and still would be transformative. And so, ultimately the idea that he's some historic pro-labor president, it's complete bullshit. This is very closely analogous to when Ronald Reagan famously broke the strike of the air traffic controllers and it put a chill through labor for a generation. These sorts of actions from the federal government have a widespread impact on the entire labor movement, aside from just this industry that it directly impacts.
Well, I would love to see the workers go on strike anyway, and then see what Biden does.
Yeah.
Because, okay, all right, you wanna play this game? I'm the most pro-union president. Okay, what are you going to do? You're going to fire all of them like Ronald Reagan did?
Send in
Is
the
that what you're going to
National
do?
Guard like we have in rail strikes past. I mean, it would be a wildcat, technically illegal strike.
I don't give a fuck. Solidarity.
Okay, I don't either, but it's not our jobs and lives and potential being, thrown in prison on the line. So what's more likely to happen, you do have some workers who are saying fuck it, we should strike anyway. I think what's more likely to happen is what has been happening over the past number of years, which is that they just quit. They leave. They move on to other industries. And you already have rail freight dramatically understaffed. That's part of what led to these incredibly onerous sick leave, and lack of sick leave policies and just shifting the burden onto the remaining workforce. So you have more workers who are likely to leave and will be very hard to replace them. And so a critical part of our supply chain, which we all supposedly care a lot about, is going to be undercut even more than it already is. And then we'll run around wondering why is inflation high? Why aren't our goods getting where they're supposed to go? It's because you guys screwed the workers over who you need to do this.
Yeah. And the thing that pisses me off the most is the dishonesty in what they did here. We're going to split the bills. It's well, we know why you're doing that.
Yeah.
We know you're doing that so you can virtue signal like you support the workers when you substantively do not support the workers. I want to give credit the only Democrats who did the right thing here. Representative Norma Torres, Representative Rashida Tlaib, Representative Mary Peltola, that's the new one from Alaska.
Yeah.
Mark
pro-fish.
Pocan.
She's very pro-fish, Mary Peltola.
Mark Pocan actually did the right thing. Surprising. I'm genuinely surprised by that. Donald Norcross, Jared Golden, Mark DeSaulnier, and Judy Chu. So that means AOC, Ilhan Omar, Jamal Bowman, who, by the way, was virtue signaling on Twitter about how much he supports workers.
Yeah.
And then you stabbed him in the fucking back. And don't lie to me and I didn't know that if we split the bills that this was going to be the result of it. My ass, you didn't know that. My ass. We're burying the conversation that we're going to have here with Jonah because like we're talking about all the things we're going to talk about.
Jonah will have even more to say about all of this and how we got to this point.
Correct. So
because he's been the best, one of the best. There have been a number of good labor reporters on this, but Jonah has been a must follow and has really put the voices of the workers themselves at the center of his coverage, which that's the other aspect of this that I want to talk to him about, which is like the media failure on this story has been profound.
It's disgusting that they can't state the obvious, which is what we just said, which is, oh, you're separating the bills so that the paid sick leave dies.
Yeah.
Like that's a stone cold fact, and nobody in mainstream media will say it.
Yeah.
Nobody will say it.
Well, they've taken the narrative from the railroad bosses the whole time. The number of stories I read that were reported, supposed to be about a potential rail strike and didn't even mention the just basic legitimate concerns that these workers have and the fact that they get no paid sick leave, or don't mention the stock buy. All that's like just completely ignores this and just focuses on like, oh my God, they'll shut down the economy. We can't have that, which again is a great, which is really useful. And also didn't mention that the last time when we were close to a strike, it actually wasn't the strike that started to come into effect. They started to have a lockout. They started to intentionally shut down the rail lines to sort of wield this economic weapon as leverage to get their way. So yeah, the media malpractice on this has been really disgusting and something that I know Jonah will have strong feelings on as well.
And let me just say, when Biden does something good, I give him credit. Mm-hmm. And there are sometimes that gets me in trouble with the left or with my own audience.
How much have I talked about the NLRB?
Right.
I'm sure it's annoying how much I talk about it.
How many times have I talked about the student loan debt reduction? How many times have I talked? I'm the only person who's ever brought up the fact that Biden signed an executive order doing a $15 minimum wage for all federal government contractors and employees. That's over 300,000 people who got a raise because of an executive order that he signed. You have to give credit where it's due, right? And so, I'm fair. I'm nuanced. I'll tell you the good things and I'll tell you the bad things. But the fact of the matter is, there's no putting lipstick on this pig.
Mm-mm.
There's no putting lipstick on this pig. We know exactly what the fuck you did here.
Yep.
You stabbed organized labor in the back, and people are going to remember that.
Yep.
They're going to remember that.
Yes, they will.
So anyway, we'll come back to this whole conversation with Jonah. He knows more about it than Crystal or I know, and so we'll get into the specifics. But before we do that, so there's some kind of good news to discuss here as well. The good news is, they had a vote on what's called the Respect for Marriage Act in the Senate, which is honestly it's a bipartisan deal and it's a compromise bill that they passed. So let me set this up for everybody. I'm sure all you guys remember when Roe versus Wade was overturned. You had Clarence Thomas write that, hey, we should take a look at Obergefell next, which is fancy justice way of saying we should overturn gay marriage.
Yep.
And so, that put shockwaves through the political world. Everybody was like, holy shit, they might actually overturn the right to gay marriage next. And so what happened is the House took a vote on it and they passed basically the status quo as law. So just so everybody understands, when the Supreme Court says that you have a right to gay marriage, then that's the supreme law of the land. And they're saying this is our interpretation of the Constitution is that under equal protection, you have a right to get gay married if you want to get gay married. That's different from passing a federal law saying that you can get gay married. So what they did here is they passed the law through the House basically to keep the status quo. And the idea is if the Supreme Court overturns it, then you still have it as the law of the land because Congress passed it. So it passed, but there were 157 Republicans who voted against the right to gay marriage.
Wow.
Which is astonishing because you have an issue. It's a 70% issue in the country. This is now, it's game, set, match.
Their own base is majority in favor of this
Correct.
At this point as well.
Correct.
Yeah, so they're voting, at odds with even their own base on this issue.
So it's just the hardcore evangelical fundamentalists. These are the only people in the country that are still left against it. So it gets to the Senate, and guess what? Because of the Republicans, they go, this thing ain't going to pass. It's going to die. So everybody's like, okay, well, what do we do now, right? And so then some people on the Democratic side said, well, maybe we can work out a deal with the more moderate Republicans if we make a compromise. And so the compromise was if the Supreme Court overturns the right to gay marriage, we will still protect the right to gay marriage, but because of religious liberty protections, if an individual church or whatever doesn't want to marry you, you got to pick a different church. You got to go to a different church. So it's allowing for people to have religious liberty objections while still protecting the overall institution of gay marriage.
Aren't they also protecting the infamous right of the baker not to bake the gay wedding cake or whatever? Is that in here as well?
I don't know if that particular thing is in there, but I do know that a protection for interracial marriage is also in this bill.
Yeah.
Okay. So look, it's a compromise bill. Now, if you say to me, hey, Kyle, which would you prefer, the bill that the House passed or the one that the Senate was working on, I would say without a doubt the one that the House passed, because that's just protecting it as it is right now, which is you have a right, and I don't think anybody can reject you even under the way it works now, because it's a constitutional right.
Right.
Okay? But if you tell me it's this or nothing, well, then I'm absolutely going to take this, because you need to protect people's rights, even if you have to make a gross compromise, right? So we have the vote. 61 senators vote in favor of it. Every single Democrat, and then, a couple of Republicans.
12 Republicans, I think.
Yeah. And so I'm going to show everybody here. These are the Republicans who voted against it, okay? We have Richard Shelby, Republican of Alabama, Tommy Tuberville, John Boozman, awesome name, by the way, Long Neck Tom Cotton Eye Joe, Marco Rubio, Rick Scott, Mike Crapo, that's a correct last name if you ask me, Jim Risch, Mike Braun, Chuck Grassley, who's about 917 years old, Roger Marshall, Jerry Morin, Mitch McConnell, Rand Paul voted against it. Rand Paul, Mr. I'm a libertarian, but I'm not really a libertarian. Bill Cassidy, John Kennedy, Cindy Hyde-Smith, Roger Wicker, Josh Hawley, Mr. I'm a populist, except fuck equal rights. Steve Daines, Deb Fisher, Kevin Kramer, John Hoeven, Jim Inhofe, James Langford, Lindsey Graham, Tim Scott, Mike Rounds, John Thune, Marsha Blackburn, Bill Haggerty, John Cornyn, Ted Cruz, Mike Lee, Ron Johnson, and John Barrasso. So these are 36 Republicans voted not just against gay marriage, against a compromise bill on gay marriage that still, quote unquote, protects religious liberty. That's fucking insane.
It also apparently doesn't even prohibit states from taking steps to ban or restrict same-sex marriage if Obergefell was overturned. So it's even more of a compromise than just, it has this like religious liberty protection, but it even preserves the ability of states to go and be bigoted and say no gay marriage here, but it still wasn't good enough for them. And I think one thing to note about this, because you look at the politics of it and you're sort of like, it doesn't make sense. Like, this issue is overwhelmingly popular, even among your own base. You're on a step now, like, what are you doing? But you look at that list, Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, Marco Rubio, they all have presidential aspirations, and they're worried that the religious right, which is very well organized, is going to be a problem for them if they vote the correct way on this bill.
You're going to get through the primary, though, and then you're going to fucking face plan in the general. People don't like this shit, man. And then let me also say this, and I don't think.
By the way, none of those dudes I just mentioned are going to get through the primary either.
No, yeah,
not
correct.
one of
They're
them.
not.
So
They're
it's all a fantasy.
Exactly, unless Trump goes to prison or has a heart attack and dies, and Ron DeSantis shits himself on stage. In that scenario, maybe one of them will get through. Right?
Maybe, but I still don't think so.
But here's my controversial / I don't think it's controversial at all take. Curious what you think. The definition of bigoted is obstinately or unreasonably attached to a belief, opinion, or faction, in particular, prejudiced against or antagonistic toward a person or people on the basis of their membership of a particular group. I don't know how you can look at somebody who's against gay marriage, even a compromise bill on that, and say they are not a bigot, because if somebody is against interracial marriage, which again, by the way, this bill would protect, right? If somebody's against interracial marriage, nobody even debates anymore if that person is a racist or a bigot. It's considered obvious that they're a bigot.
Yeah.
You can't say, I'm not a bigot, but I think we should ban white people and black people from getting married. No, you are. That's like the definition of it. So what I would say to these people is, okay, you want to have this position? Fine. Don't you dare whine and bitch and moan and cry. Oh my God, they called me a bigot. They called me racist. They called me naughty words. Own it. If you're going to take this position, fucking own it. And when somebody says it to you, be like, that is correct. That is what I am. And I am proud of that.
Yeah, the excuses that they made too, like the one that really stood out to me, Marco Rubio. He was like, he didn't want to, because, he's trying to cultivate this image of like, I'm the younger, cooler GOP dude. And like, I understand these modern issues, cultural shifts, whatever. So he didn't want to overtly say, I'm a bigot and I don't think gay people should be able to get married. So instead he was like, this is a waste of time and we don't need the bill. It's like, okay, but now the bill is here. It doesn't take you any more time to vote yes than to vote no. And so clearly you oppose it. And, I think there's two ways of looking at this. Like, on the one hand, you have to celebrate the fact that such a thing could get through. You have to celebrate the progress that obviously as a society we've made on this issue. I mean, it wasn't that long ago. Barack Obama himself was opposed to it. Hillary Clinton ran as being opposed to it. I mean, it took Joe Biden actually.
Yeah. I like the gays, man. They can get married.
Forcing Obama's hand to, for them to even come to the right place and stop having the bigoted position here. But on the other hand, you look at the other, 36? And you're like,
36, yeah.
What the hell is going on that you still have so many just like open bigots as elected leaders of your party.
So it gets even worse than that. I want to show everybody a Laura Ingraham video here because this is the line that the right is going with. This is a prominent Fox News host, and they are attacking the Republicans who voted the right way. So take a look.
Now, we saw this dynamic play out yesterday when 12 Republican senators, all the usual suspects, voted for the deceptively titled Respect for Marriage Act. While purporting to safeguard marital rights of same-sex couples, the law will actually end up gutting the religious liberty rights across the country. Social conservatives, of course, are insulted, yet they're not really surprised.
Yeah, so, I mean, look, credit to those Republicans who voted for it. I say that very light credit because these are also the same people who were like, I will not vote for a bill that passed the House, which protects the current status quo.
Yeah.
In other words, we have to fuck people over somewhat, right?
Well, Ben Shapiro, before this all happened, was
Matt
like,
Walsh too?
you should be kicked out of the Republican Party if you vote for this bill. You
Hilarious.
aren't one of us.
Dude.
Okay, good luck with that.
You want a permanent 30% block in the country? By all means. You're just handing elections over to the opposition.
Yeah, and people like him don't want to admit how incredibly toxic their extreme cultural views on abortion and gay marriage and transgender rights are politically. I mean, Trump was a big factor in the midterm elections, but Roe versus Wade being overturned was probably the most decisive factor in turning what could have been a red wave into just basically a historic disaster for them. They do not want to acknowledge how incredibly extreme, fringe, radical, and out of step with the American public they are at this point.
Yeah, I mean, this is about basic equality. I don't know if people understand all the nuances of this, but like, if we didn't have gay marriage, you would lose visitation rights in the hospital, you would lose inheritance rights, you would lose tax rights. There's a whole bunch of legal implications to that.
Yeah.
So it's not just about like, let them have the label. No, there's something deeper at play here. And there's already, by the way, about 1 million gay married couples in the US. So that means 2 million people. And so under their ideal system, what would you like? Would you like to, take away their right to marry retroactively? Would you like strip the label from them, or would it just be from here on out? Like, how would it even work? How would this work in the long run?
I mean, there are the cruelties inherent in not having legal rights as an actual legal spouse, like material benefits that you get and rights that you have if you are legally married. But there is also just, that's your society saying you're a second-class citizen, that you don't deserve the same rights as everybody else. And, the ugliness of that is what Americans have overwhelmingly rejected. I think people like Ben Shapiro, Matt Walsh, and other cultural, right-wing conservatives have gotten a little too emboldened they felt like they were having success on some other cultural issues. They thought like the kids' trans things in school and that they were winning, making up ground on that was going well for them. And so they thought they could go back to this issue that, the American people have just completely moved on from. And they thought that they could maybe have a case here and go back and give it another shot. And no.
Yeah.
People are not going there with you. And in fact, it really exposes the rest of the positions that maybe you had more political traction with as kind of a Trojan horse for a huge rollback of a lot of rights that people are taking for granted.
That's a great point, and that's a great analysis. All right, tell me about what's going on in New York with the homeless population and what the mayor, Eric Adams, is up to.
So Eric Adams has taken a more aggressive and draconian, and some would say cruel, approach to dealing with the homeless population in New York than Mayor Bill de Blasio did. And the latest policy shift is he is pushing the police to remove more visibly mentally ill homeless people from the streets and to ultimately get them institutionalized. So the previous standard had been if you have someone who seems like they are a threat to others, that the police would remove them and, get them evaluated and potentially institutionalized. The new policy and standard is that if they appear to be a risk to themselves and are unable to take care of themselves, then the police are being instructed to remove them from the streets and potentially get them institutionalized.
How do you determine that?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it?
Is it just subjective criteria, or is there like a checklist of things that have to be going on, or what?
Well, that's where this gets very complicated and very difficult, and where even the police are not really happy with this shift. There's reporting now that they were really caught off guard because these are not mental health professionals. they are not, as of today, trained to make that judgment. Now, supposedly, they're going to be getting training in how to make this assessment ultimately. But, it really shows you that there is a role for other responses than just police officers in terms of dealing with, challenging problems, including homelessness and visible mental illness on the streets.
Yeah. So, when it comes to this issue, I think it gets complicated because there's a long-term conversation, like long-term fixes.
Yeah.
But then there's also a giant question about what do you do in the short term, right? So for long-term, put a roof over everybody's head. What are homeless people missing? Houses. So put a roof over everybody's head. And they have done initiatives in other countries, and even in the state of Utah, I believe, where they put an onus on this.
Yes.
And it works.
So
turns out it works.
New York City has a right to shelter. And so there are, shelter beds available to anyone who wants them.
Those shelters are a mess.
The New York City population. But that's the thing, is those shelters are a mess.
And they're for profit, by the way.
Sometimes dangerous, can have like onerous sort of like draconian restrictions on them, the quality of them very low, all of that. So that in part is why you have, according to some counts, somewhere around 3,000, but people think that's an undercount, people who are choosing not to be in the shelters and to live on the streets. So it's not just about a roof. It's about what is the quality of that situation. You have to be able to beat the quality of the situation of sleeping outside, which seems like a low bar, but New York City has been unable to meet. Well,
I covered the story, I don't know if it was probably a year or two ago now. I think you may have seen the story as well. There was this big New York Times expose on these homeless shelters and how they were it was like a total scam. The guy was just taking this money from the government and doing whatever he wanted with it and padding his own wallet, and then these places would be totally dilapidated, rats running around, not up to code in any way.
Right.
So this is not, that's obviously not the solution. So long term, look, I think you need to have basically government rehab facilities that are well kept with professionals. I think that needs to be there. I think you need to have mental health professionals where this is their job and they get paid well for it. And that's something, again, that should be a government initiative. And then, everybody should have a roof over their heads. I think I always like the idea of, those like mini houses that sometimes you see on like HGTV or those other shows where they can be very beautiful and really nice and new and everything and shiny and sparkly, but they're those like mini houses where you could stay. I see no issue. I think this can be addressed. This issue can be addressed. And also studies have shown if you take the approach that I'm talking about, in the long run, you actually save money too. It's fiscally responsible because it costs more to taxpayers to have people without a roof over their head, because then they have run-ins with the police, they end up in the hospital, and they run up these giant bills, and there's all these other issues, financial issues that pop up as a result of it. So long-term, I think that's the answer. Short-term, look, I think there is, it's true. Whether or not people want it to be true, it is true. They've had votes in certain places about these like sweeps, like getting rid of the homeless encampments.
Yeah.
And every time they put it to a direct vote, people are like, yeah, get rid of all the stuff. Like get rid of the homeless encampments. So what do we do on that front? Because on the one hand, you talk about like, well, do you kind of have a right to, if you're homeless and basically being in public is your home, don't you have a right to be wherever you want to be? Or does like the instinct for, no, we want to keep things clean and orderly and, make kids feel safe or whatever the fuck, or does that override the other instinct? So what do you think on that?
There's a few things I want to say here. First of all, I am on the mental illness piece. I am sympathetic to the idea that it is not progressive and it is not compassionate to allow people who are severely mentally ill and don't have friends or loved ones around who can help them, that it is not compassionate to just say, just let them be. So the core idea here of let's get people help, I have no problem with. The problem for me with this policy comes in and having the police be the ones to execute it. And, it's interesting. The New York Times did they went and interviewed people who might be impacted by the policy. They interviewed a woman who is herself unhoused and herself schizophrenic. And she had mixed feelings about the policy. On the one hand, she said actually the reason that she is able to be on the medicine she needs and have some level of mental stability is because police had taken her to get treatment. And she had spent time in a psych ward, and that she attributed that to her own current mental stability. On the other hand, she was very leery of the idea of handing police more power. And this was a Black woman who felt that she might be a target of that policy. So I think the problem comes in when it's the police who the burden is put on to assess what is the situation with this person and what's the best thing for them to do. And I think there would be an opening here for the left to make the case of, okay, this is why it doesn't make sense to have the police involved in every one of these situations. Now, sometimes you can have mentally ill people who, sometimes can be dangerous or sometimes can be violent. So sometimes it may make sense to have police there as well. But this is where you really need social workers, mental health professionals to be involved from the beginning. So that's number one. Number two, other countries have really dealt with this issue because they have a much more generous social safety net.
Yeah.
Cities have much greater resources to have shelters and housing available that is vastly superior to ultimately sleeping outside. And so, I think you have to have those pieces in place first before you can just go in and sweep out the homeless encampments. Because, by the way, if you look at what's happened since Mayor Adams has come in and he's done these, come in and let me just clear everything out, it's not like that solved the problem. Those people have just dispersed to other places. You've just relocated the issue, but not actually dealt with it.
Right. That's true. That's true. So when I think about Kanye, when I think about this issue, seriously,
Okay.
because he's a perfect example of somebody who, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder.
Yeah.
He doesn't take his medicine. He's very open about that fact. And so now he's going around and he's telling everybody, they tried to lock me up. And really what he's referring to there is an involuntary hold for a mental health crisis. And so some people would look at that and they go, oh my God, that's so nefarious. That's messed up. And you're taking away his rights as a person. Other people would look at that and say, obviously the more humane thing to do is to temporarily lock him up so he's not a danger to himself or others and hopefully get him on medication, right? And so this is where I think people struggle. They have an issue with it, especially people on the left, because on the one hand, they want to say, look, a homeless person is not hurting anybody. They have a right to go where they want to go and do what they want to do. And, everything's fine. Let's not act like this is a bigger issue than it is, right?
Right.
But then on the other hand, the other perspective is no, it actually is more, it's a more kind thing to do, an altruistic thing to do, and a better thing for all of society if when somebody is going through some sort of mental health crisis, there is help that's there for them. And it's one of those things where it's you might not think this is best for you right now, but it actually is best for you.
Yeah.
Right? And so, on the question of the involuntary holds, I'm definitely in favor of them. But to your point, it's the details matter. And so who do you leave that up to make the decision? How subjective is the criteria versus objective? And again, I think in the long run, I think most reasonable people agree that there's all the evidence out there already that some places that have very good public housing that we can just build public housing and make it so that you attack this problem head on. And so you won't have nearly as many homeless people, if any homeless people at all, right? So in the long run, it's we all agree. The question is, what do you do in the interim? What do you do in the short run?
Right.
Because there's going to be a lot of people, and we're doing ourselves no favors by not acknowledging this is the majority of the population who will say, just like they did in the direct votes on this issue, get rid of the homeless encampments, do the sweep, criminalize it, just get these people basically out of my sight type thing.
Yeah, but like I said, it's not. Ultimately, without those other supports and resources, that's not going to be a real solution for the long term. People are just going to find another place to be. There's so many complicated pieces of this because also on the involuntary hold, there are some places that there was a reform movement to make it much more difficult to just commit people to a psych ward, which was, which was needed, which was very well intentioned. Some places then went too far. I'm thinking in particular in Virginia, a guy you guys might remember, Creed Deeds, he ran for governor against Bob McDonnell. Horrific situation unfolded here where his 24-year-old son was clearly in the midst of a mental break. They were trying everything they could to get him help, and they could not get anywhere that would keep him because of the way that the laws were, and it was so difficult to get him committed. And it was basically the person had to have already been violent and hurt themselves or hurt someone else before you could actually get that involuntary hold. And so what ends up happening is he tries to kill Cree, his dad. He ends up killing himself because they were not able to intervene and get him the help that he needed in time. So Cree actually ended up, he was still a lawmaker, he's a state senator, ended up spearheading reform to that law. And, there's no doubt this is one of those areas where you've got competing priorities because people have civil liberties. You don't want to be in a situation where you can just say, like, that person's crazy and get them locked up. On the other hand, when someone is really mentally unwell, it's for their interest and everyone else's interest to be able to have those protections in place. So there's number one, they're striking that balance. There's another piece of, as part of, I think that same movement, you had a defunding of psychiatric wards. And so in New York in particular, but a lot of places around the country.
Yeah, that part is crazy to me.
Around the country, there are not enough beds.
Reagan destroyed those things. And people always point to that as like, that's the problem.
And so instead of having people go to, get psychiatric care, instead they get locked up. And that's obviously been a disaster, and that doesn't help anyone or anything. It doesn't deal with the underlying problem. It's obviously not compassionate to the people at all. It's criminalizing something that's really a mental health issue. So that's another piece of this. So I don't know. I just look at these problems, which are popping up in cities across the country, no matter what ideological faction happens to be in charge. And I don't think it's something you can really solve if you are just one city trying to do it on your own, because you need broader resources from the federal government. The last thing I'll say is, because I did a monologue on this week, so it's top of mind, cities are also facing a budget crunch where they had an infusion of cash from pandemic relief programs, but they've, in recent years, during the pandemic, they've had a mass exodus of affluent professionals who are moving out to the suburbs, who are taking with them their tax dollars, who are taking with them their retail shopping dollars, who aren't in the offices anymore. So you're having a tax base that is collapsing. So it's going to make it even more difficult for these cities individually to have the resources they need to actually address the problem and not just try to push it to the side.
To your point, yes, cities can only do the short-term fixes. Right? Because they, like you said, they're only equipped to do the so-called short-term fixes. Right. So, for example, like Rudy Giuliani in the 1990s, when he was mayor of New York City, he cracked down on homelessness and criminalized it. And the homelessness was out of your plain sight in the city, but they just moved elsewhere effectively. Right. So is that a fix, or is that just kicking the can down the road or passing the buck? It's more passing the buck than anything.
I mean, that is more just making wealthy people feel more comfortable.
That is exactly what that is.
Yeah.
But, again, when you look at the polling, people are like, that's better than doing nothing. But you know what I'm saying? It gets complex. So, but I will say this. This is my final point, then we can wrap it up on this and we can start talking to Jonah. But so there's different tiers of homelessness, right? There's the one that's you're homeless, but you have a friend or a family member you can sleep on their couch and, move around that way for a while until you get back on your feet. Then there's newly on the street, but still have your stuff together enough where, there's a chance for you to make a comeback. And then there's homeless that's you've been on the street, it's been for months or years, and, you haven't had a shower in a long time, and you're dealing with other issues as well, drug addiction or mental illness or whatever. So there's different levels to this stuff. And the first group of homeless is totally out of sight, out of mind in this country. And I would imagine that that's an absolute scourge.
True.
And people need to realize when you talk about homelessness, it's not just everybody's mentally ill or everybody has drug addiction.
Yeah.
Quite the opposite. I would argue probably the majority of them, it's just a money issue.
It's just poverty.
It's just poverty.
Yeah.
And so you're going to have to address economics in order to fix this in any serious way, which again brings us back to the long-term conversation where if you have good public housing, if you had, some sort of UBI type program, something of that nature, just better social safety nets in general, free healthcare, et cetera, then in the long run, I get you would reduce homelessness by at least 50%, probably more. And then the ones that, where it's not as much a systemic issue, it's more of a personal pathology issue, then we can address those on their own with a whole different approach.
Yeah.
So,
and it's not like these things are separate either. I mean, the amount of stress that you're under when you're poor doesn't help anyone's mental health. The amount of stress that you're under when you're unhoused, when you're living on the street, that doesn't help anyone's mental health or ability to get clean if they're struggling with addiction. So yeah, it is incredibly complex. It's a difficult situation. And I just don't think that these cities, any of them, are going to be really equipped to deal with the roots of the problem without federal resources, support, things like universal health care that includes mental health, for example, things like, subsidies to make sure that they can have that housing which isn't vermin infested and, dilapidated and dangerous and falling down. So,
yep. Let's go ahead and throw it to Jonah.
Jonah Furman, wonderful reporter, great on all labor issues. He is a writer for Labor Notes. He also has a great Substack that just breaks down everything that's going on in the labor movement that week. It's called Who Gets the Bird? Let's get to it.
If you want to see me and Crystal Ball interview legends like Noam Chomsky, Cornel West, and more, subscribe to Crystal, Kyle, and Friends on Substack. $5 a month gets you the video version a day early. Remember, we take 0 ad dollars for this podcast. Or you can sign up on Substack for free and get the audio version a day later. Link in the video description box below.